Thank you for joining us on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. In this week's episode, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Michael Spaziani. Michael Spaziani is the principal of Michael Spaziani Architect Inc. in Port Credit. It's an architectural firm that was established in 1986. Michael has received numerous awards in recognition for his work. He specializes in commercial, retail, and waterfront condo developments, and has served as an expert witness for heritage assessments. Michael is currently an advisor for LPAT, the local Planning Appeal Tribunal for the province. He's a member of the City of Mississauga's Design Review Panel, Mississauga Urban Design Awards, director with the Port Credit Community Foundation, director with Heritage Mississauga, and a past director with the Art Gallery of Mississauga, and a past member of the Mississauga Heritage Advisory Committee, amongst numerous other community involvements, too numerous to mention. Michael has been involved in a lot of facets of arts, culture, and heritage in the course of his time here in the city of Mississauga. In 2010, Michael was inducted into the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada College of Fellows. Our talk today with Michael is focusing on a presentation he gave several years ago with the Culture Cafe, and it focused on 40 years of architectural and cultural development in the city of Mississauga. And so it's a distinct pleasure to spend some time with Michael Spaziani today, exploring the development story and the development history of the city of Mississauga. Well, joining me this week on Ask a Historian is Michael Spaziani. And Michael, a longtime architect here in South Mississauga, but a passionate advocate for history and culture in our city, and amongst many other things, a guitar collector and player. But Michael, several years ago, you were part of a Culture Cafe speaker series, and you gave a presentation on 40 years of culture and its connections to architecture in Mississauga, kind of the different trends and eras through our city. And it was absolutely fascinating. And you've agreed to come on the show and share some of that background with me, and this idea of Mississauga pulling back the covers and seeing how she came to be. And thank you for joining us.
Well, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Wonderful. So let's jump in right away. Jump 2 feet in here. And I know from your presentation, you kind of look back at the 40 years of Mississauga's development, or I guess from 1974 to the present, but how the city is shaped the way that it is, both in the cultural aspect, but also in its built form. And you broke it into segments. In your first segment, you called Carmania. And how that impacted the city that would come to be. And I'm wondering if you can kind of step back and kind of bridge the culture and the architecture for us.
Yeah, and the 40 years is important because Mississauga really, as you said, was only founded in 74 formally as this new city. And so that was the inspiration, how a city can develop so quickly, and it has developed quickly, and what influences guided that. And some of the hard city existed before 74. I mean, a lot of the suburban component, and that's what I mean by the sprawl period. It was the bedroom that was more of an was something that started with an idea that you put, and then there was this idea that everybody should have and would have their own private single detached house. And so Mississauga catered to that. And I spoke with Hazel McCallion about this as well. And she admitted that this is what people wanted in that time. And she was very good at doing and listening and doing what people wanted. So Mississauga starts with this kind of impulse of using the car, relying on the car. And that was the strength of Mississauga. People chose it because they could have a car or three, and they could go to drive in. There was one here, a food outlet at A&W, I believe, down in Lakeshore and Port Credit. I mean, people lived and breathed this kind of late 60s, early 70s kind of idea. The car is what we needed, and we cherished it. It was almost a religion. So it was the hallmark where we started. And then, and so that to me was one of the very important kind of starting points in Mississauga. And the other thing I was trying to make a connection too between the buildings that would come in Mississauga beyond the single detached house and the period in which they were created. And I've always said there's a connection between cultural efforts, whether it's music, dance, graphic design, and music. They're all related to architecture of the day. So there's always a connection that exists. And I sort of jokingly went back and looked at those, let's call them periods of design or style, fashion through the 70s, the 80s, 90s, and tried to pinpoint how they affected Mississauga's development. So it was a bit lighthearted because it was hard to really make the connection. It was more visual and more me making jokes about it. But I think there was a kernel of truth to it. And remember, the Carr period also was inspired by things like Don Mills. And Don Mills, was considered one of those brave new areas where a new form of community was emerging. And the things that we've now come to sort of laugh at and not laugh at, but we don't tolerate anymore. New communities, you cannot put a cul-de-sac in as much as people want them. But anyway, Don Mills inspired a bit of that first wave. These that emerged here all were based on mostly single detached houses. There was a fellow named Macklin Hancock who lived here and who was the designer behind Don Mills. So there was actually an interesting kind of connection to Mississauga or connection to, let's say, the movement, Don Mills and the creation of Don Mills that started here in Mississauga. It was kind of a reverse influence in that it affected a northern suburb in Toronto, but came back to influence us here in Mississauga. And Hancock was all about modernism. Some of his buildings were quite sleek and box-like. Not at all a traditional approach in that sense, but it was home ownership, affordable home ownership. I think it's an important idea too. And that was the kind of spirit that started us here in Mississauga, and people cherished.
And is in this concept of car mania, I mean, if you're reliant on cars, then there must be the road infrastructure to support the cars. I mean, do we see the evolution of our landscape from a transportation perspective really born? I'm guessing we do, but what built forms come out of that? I think of the big sprawling shopping malls and things. What comes out of that car mania phase from an architectural perspective?
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting Bruce McLaughlin, and we had a chat about this because he spoke about his vision for Mississauga. And his vision started from an airplane, 50,000 feet above. The lands at the time were kind of open and farm fields. And he saw this potential for essentially a whole new city. And the city was anchored with a shopping mall with surface parking. So the inception of some of the big parts of Mississauga, and this is later, not to do with the early villages, which is a whole other discussion and a whole different era. This is modern Mississauga, and he saw it as a let's call it a mall-centered place, Square One, called it Square One because it was the center of everything. And you pretty well had to drive there. There was nothing within a walking distance, not many. I mean, there's great views I had in my presentation. You may have them, the aerial views of farmland that very quickly converted to this main geometric Square One place, which was effectively a large parking lot, one-story buildings. And that was the inception of a very popular movement. Developers loved it because it was easy selling. If people were moving out of an urban environment like in Toronto, where I started my career, you walked everywhere, you took transit, you rode your bike. But coming to Mississauga, you really couldn't get around without a car. So the car was the market appeal, and it grew and it caught on like wildfire. So developers lined up, they built it out. They were all very successful. Guys like Iggy Canna did very well doing that. Started with one house, bought the lot next door, built the next house, and the rest is history. He grew to be one of the major developers, just like McLaughlin did. Harold Shipp, Gordon Shipp, these guys that are also very, very powerful and very much part of that early movement within Mississauga. So Mississauga as we know it, we still see that, and that's a cherished component of the city, and it's not going to go away easily. If we go to public meetings today for new developments, we see people remind us that, oh, traffic's going to be a nightmare. So the city grows up with all of these arteries that forced the cars onto the main streets, Erin Mills Parkway. Mississauga Road less so, but certainly Highway 10, near Ontario Street. There was a conscious effort to spin people out of neighborhoods onto the major roads and not use the traditional urban grid, which Toronto was built on and older cities are built on. Those cities were often laid out by surveyors in a very simple chain by chain kind of concession grid. The grid was then subdivided with a grid of streets. And that automatically gave you all sorts of options when you walked or experienced the city. In Mississauga, we did almost the opposite. We said, you come into our private neighborhood, well, hopefully you get lost, and because the streets are curving, you'll go in and you're heading south, but when you exit, you're heading north, or you might be heading west. So it's like a salad spinner. They spin you around and they spit you out, and then you're lost. You come back onto Dundas Street, or you come out onto Erin Mills Parkway, and you say, oh, where am I? Do I go north? Do I go south? So it is an orientation device. Our approach to roads was very disorienting. People grew to know them, but I know the first time I ever experienced Mississauga, I was totally lost. And to this day, I have staff that don't know north from south, because Mississauga has some major arteries that are kind of on 45, so that already confuses the question. But, and I'm talking about younger members of our team, if they don't have a Google map guiding them, they don't know how to get around. And sometimes I've had to rely on that myself, getting lost in a subdivision. And we would call those curvy roads that go through the subdivisions, we called them dead worms in the urban design community. Sort of the dead worm was first of all the shape of it. It was curvilinear. It was disorienting, but it was the pejorative term that urban designers in urban emphasis on urban, they use that to put down the suburbs. And for a long time, I was in that camp. I was asked to work on Square One by the original architect, and I declined because to me, I was downtown. I was living the dream, big architect's office. And every young architect dreams about being in an urban environment. And Mississauga was antithetical to that. So I actually turned down that job. And I told Hazel this story because I started with this sort of hate of Mississauga, grew to love it for other reasons. And the reasons are that we were tackling the question of how do you build a new city from scratch, even with some false starts. I think there's some great optimism now with some of the approaches to the new components of the city. So that's a whole other, so I went through this cathartic kind of experience of coming out and saying, well, I'm going to boost this city. I can see great benefits in this thing. And I can see it in the transition and the transformations that are possible.
In your analysis or your perspective of the dead worm and this disorientation within the subdivision grid, what was the intent behind that? There's often, I can see often in planning, there's kind of a social engineering aspect to why they do things the way they do, and why would they take such a different approach in the early stages of Mississauga as they did in older cities like Toronto?
Well, I think it offered let's call it a different offer. So if you were coming out of a tight urban environment, first of all, you were going to get a larger lot, and it would be more naturalized with planting. But the way to understand it is to look at what is most valued in these subdivisions that have the curvilinear roads. And the cul-de-sac is a great example. The cul-de-sac is a celebration of ultimate privacy. It's like a gated community within a subdivision. Once you go into that cul-de-sac area, there might be 12 houses that share a cul-de-sac. That was considered the absolute best option for anybody. And they would line up when the houses were being put on the market, and everyone would buy those houses first, or they would buy the lot on the interior corner that had a big, wide, pie-shaped backyard.
Right.
So what you had was this kind of race to get the most privacy and the most landscape, the biggest yard that you could get, and that was the mania that we talked about in this in this road pattern that was emerging. How many lots are premium lots? How many lots are backing onto the arterial? Those were the negative lots. And that was the play. It was, how do you do this? How do you make everything tie together? And then when you overlaid let's call it the dead worm or the cul-de-sac or the windy street that disoriented you, and you tried to walk to a local plaza, you found that you had to trace the path that would take you kilometers out of your way to get to, for example, Dundas and Winston Churchill. A lot of retail on that street. But if you've ever kind of walked in the neighborhoods there, you realize to get up to go to the grocery store or something, you had to follow a very nonlinear route, non-direct route, to the point where you just say, well, I'm just going to get in the car because there's no convenience here. So, the whole Jane Jacobs thing, which was the idea of a community being of a certain size and the grid of streets with porches on the street and vitality in the street, that wasn't what Mississauga was. The action was in the backyard, not the front yard. The action was in your car, cruising in your car down Lakeshore. That's where all the fun was happening. So it was a whole cultural shift. It was a different idea about what was important. And that's how the car mania translated into physical form, and the preference for the pie-shaped lot, the cul-de-sac lot, right. And it celebrated privacy over community. And I think that was the big fault of what we were talking about.
And so now, in a way, and then we'll jump. I don't want to jump forward to the end of where we're going to get to, but in a way, you almost feel like a conscious attempt to repair that plan, to alter that plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's tough to change something as hard and as physical as infrastructure like road systems. That's not easy, as we find out. But the opportunity going forward, though, is on new tracts of land that have gone through transformations, like the Imperial Oil lands, like the hydro lands down in Lakeview. Yeah. Now Dixie Valley Mall is going. So these are the new, what we call grayfield sites that had industrial purpose, or we call them brownfield when they're polluted. We call them grayfield when they were dominated by asphalt. So Square One, dominated by asphalt parking, is now infilling in a way with exciting new ideas about how to infill and change that idea. The problem with Square One is it's too darn successful. It's going to be a slow process to undo it, but there's progress all around it. You see infilling now, some very exciting infill projects in and around Square One that involve a very urban approach to a street grid, things like that. So this is good news. I joke about some of the infill that happened in the 70s because I don't know if you recall, there were a number of buildings started to emerge. Some of the first buildings up at Square One started to emerge on a 45-degree angle. And all of a sudden, that was the design shape of new buildings that meant anything. And I wondered, where did that come from? Where did this graphic idea of shifting a building 45 somehow make it more appealing to an office occupant? And if you look at square one, the areas around square one in the mid 70s to the early 80s, you see a number of them that were informed by that. And I contrast that to what Toronto has just passed a law saying that you cannot turn your tower on any angle away from the street grid. So you have to actually make it a line.
Really? Okay.
This is something that came up recently because I do work in Toronto, and I was supporting a development there that had a tower on a bit of a skew. And the city said, no, we just passed this bylaw last year that said you can't have your buildings on an angle out of respect for the orientation effect of the visual tower. So it just shows you the way that things have changed. So Mississauga has all of this 45-degree stuff. I sort of attributed it to early 70s graphic design. I don't know, in my presentation, I had all of these graphic images from Switzerland, Swiss design, Swiss graphics. These were the best graphics you could get. And if you look at them, they're all celebrating the 45. And somehow I think that two-dimensional graphic image, to me, informed Mississauga's high design of the day. These were prestigious office buildings, and this was what was inspiring them. It wasn't things like, sculptural qualities. Fast forward to, the absolute condo, the Marilyn Monroe building, where a whole other sculptural kind of interest took shape. And that's under a whole other set of fashion influences as well. But it was, the one building too, and I think you and I have talked about, is the Sussex Centre, which I think I kind of tied that one to the disco era.
Okay.
And even, the mirror ball, glass surfaces on facets, the angular, I call it the bell-bottom shape on the street wall. To me, that was inspired by Studio 54, kind of disco glitz, and in a funny way, bell-bottoms, which might even be considered an earlier era, but somehow they all came together in the Sussex Centre as a kind of an early 80s expression of another cultural influence. So whenever I drive by that, and I got to admit, we first moved to Mississauga in '89, and so we would go up there and enjoy that place. It was kind of a place you'd get to, and there'd be some good restaurants and all of that. My kids still remember it because there was a lot of fun. I think there was ironically, a kind of a 50s restaurant in there. I forget the name of it, but that was another kind of influence going back in time, nostalgia. Anyway, there was this mix of influences and characters, and it was almost a museum or an expression of how confused we were. And this is what people both loved and my colleagues hated. I remember talking to a professor of mine from university who I told her that I'd moved to Mississauga. She said, "Oh, how could you have done that?" It was like I was, oh my God, I'm being shamed. So anyway, I had my colleagues, I call them architect snobs. They have a whole different idea about what's important, and as you age, things do change. So there was a series of those buildings in the 70s and 80s that I kind of attributed to movements that were like the Sussex Centre. And then, then we look at City Hall, which again starts to emerge mid 80s, and to Mississauga's credit, they said, look, we're growing up. We have to go to an international competition to figure out what's the right expression for this emerging city that is going to go on a new track. And it's very symbolic. It's, a new city hall. So they go to a world competition. And so what better way to attract universal or international styles or trends? And the trend of the day was what we called postmodernism. So this is the era after the modern movement. The modern movement, in a historic sense, was the Bauhaus, initiated in the 30s. Bauhaus was about minimal design, very simple design, reducing designs, less is more, Mies van der Rohe would have said. And that's, so postmodernism was a kind of recognition that there was an architectural language that was more steeped in classical history. So architects began to look at the Greek pediments, the Greek architecture, Roman architecture, the classical architecture, and that's what inspired postmodernism. It was how do you put more back into buildings? So more is more, and that was the theme that was kind of knee-jerk against the minimalist movement. So City Hall was an international kind of recognition of that movement. So when I look at it today, I mean, I now look at it as a historic movement. It did make a strong statement, and now it has, I think Celebration Square is one of the best creations, I think, of the whole business, but it was not originally programmed like that. It has adopted a program that's now, I think, very successful as a way to recognize people in this. It's not about style and just buildings, it's about spaces. So this is the next evolution that we're seeing, is the evolution of the quality of space. Space as a positive element. So you remember a space, and now you don't have to remember a building anymore. It's remembering a space. That's a big shift in the headspace. And one that, if you've been to Europe, what do you remember? You remember the Champs-Élysées, you remember the beautiful squares, you remember the spaces. Buildings are backdrops to that. You do remember buildings, but they're beautiful facades. They're much less about standalone buildings. They form streets. They don't stand alone, as separate buildings. They're not like showcases like City Halls. So that's a whole new shift that's coming now. And I think it's the backbone of our new communities. We're seeing kind of structures that are built on space, linear space, squares, piazzas, parks. These are now components that are linked together. Walkability in those spaces is critical. Programming, music events, film events, all of these things are happening in spaces. And that's, to me, the wonderful thing that's now emerging in the city. And again, it's a trend that started, I call it a kind of a language trend, because language is about respecting tradition. We talk to each other because we all share this idea about what words mean and how to form sentences. So there's syntax, grammar. Grammar is how we link together our spaces. The words are different today. They're now not individual buildings, they're buildings and open spaces. And that's what forms, let's call it the vocabulary of our city. It's a new way of thinking. It's also a very old way of thinking, before the car. So we're kind of getting back away from the car, back to some of the principles we cherished ironically, when we go traveling, we say, why can't we do this? Well, it's not easy to redo once you start on a path that's going down a different road, so to speak. No pun intended.
Back to our Carmania.
So, and then,
sorry, can I ask you one question before I forget my question? How much of this evolution of planning, we see from your beginning, we talked about the Carmania, and then, as you called it, the disco fever. And then you get into kind of the postmodern and that development of this, creating the spaces that people will interact with rather than the standalone building. But how much of that is a product of a maturing landscape where space is becoming a challenge versus early on with Carmania in that era where all you had was space?
That goes to the question of economics, right? When land was cheap and farms, you could buy a 200-acre farm for thousands of dollars, not millions of dollars. So, that informed what you had to do to make a profit. And just the simplest thing to do was to bulldoze some land, put in some roads, and build some stick houses. But now Mississauga has run out of those spaces. And by virtue of its center and its proximity to airport, to the greater Toronto area, the greater Toronto Hamilton area, it now has land values that are, you know, due to the scarcity of large parcels, number one, that forces land value up. And if there is going to be redevelopment, you have to factor in those costs and the densities. So now we're going into a phase of intensification and densification, like Dixie Mall. And, you know, we did work on the mall in Streetsville as well. Same thing. How do you infill that mall? Well, those land values now have book values that are far outstrip the original values and speak to returns on investments that are that much higher and that much more demanding. So and this is the kind of joke I tell people, it seems today like you can't even build a 6-story building with underground parking and make any money at it, because the cost of construction, the cost of land, the cost of labor has all blossomed. And this is now the environment, the development environment we see in Mississauga. We see very expensive tracts of land, and in response, developers and the demand allows it, investment demand. A lot of the condominiums we build now are marketed to offshore investors, and they look to park the money there and get a return. And it's so that puts a pressure now on all of anything seen as spare land, and a lot of it is old industrial lands or waterfront lands or old malls that are now kind of going through a retail change, which makes it less viable to keep. So it's all of those pressures that come to bear. So Mississauga today is all about intensification. If you look at, I know the company Daniels, they're developers who have taken a real liking to Mississauga because they are finding sites here that allow them to do buildings in the 30 and 40-story range with very little in the way of stopping. And remember what Mississauga did in city center. They simply said, we're just going to establish an unlimited height. You don't have to constrain yourself to any height limit. And comparing that to Toronto, that was like, oh boy, have I died and gone to heaven? So Daniels went through this. They said, look, we love working in Mississauga. We don't have to fight for 30 stories. In fact, I think they added 10 stories to one of their projects simply because when they started demarking the building at 30 stories, they found the demand was there for 40. So in a matter of another weekend, they got another 10 stories approved and sold another 100 units or so. I mean, these numbers are rough, but the concept was there that there was no impediment to density and height. And that spawned a lot of the towers we see more recently in city center. The most famous one, of course, is the Maryland building. It's become an icon. And I always joke about this because, you know, I'm in Italy and I say, oh, you know, I'm from the Toronto area. And they say, oh, do you have that building, the one that's spiral and twisted? I said, yes, we do. That's Mississauga. And of course, I never say, if I said I was from Mississauga, their eyes would sort of go, and they said, well, where's that? So we stand in the shadow of Toronto, but Mississauga now has a collection of, I think, some very fine newer buildings that have come in and have plans for more of those to, again, reclaim the walkability and the less reliance on the car. These are things that are beginning to inform interest in those markets. The LRT coming to Square One, for example, it supports, it's like an irrigation. It's like irrigation in a garden. You provide transit and the buildings grow. You provide water and plants grow. It's almost that when the Yonge subway went in, and there's great historic photos of this up Yonge Street, and you could see at all the intersections, Eglinton's, their buildings blossomed. They literally just sprouted up because people found they want to live in that city environment. They don't want to have to use a car. Transit gave them options that they didn't previously have. So this is beginning to happen here. It's a slower process, but it's beginning to happen here. In Square One, I mean, I kind of joked, it took 40 years for them to find their mojo. And the mojo was, this kind of intensified development. And, I called it the 40-year-old virgin. And that, kind of the pun was, the play was that Marilyn Monroe was the thing that turned us on here and got us into a new mode of building. So again, it was another era, another kind. All of a sudden they said, no, we can do something more on a world stage. And that's happening. And that's, to me, is what's exciting today about what's going on. We have awakened. We're starting to create a very great excitement around buildings. I trust that some of these new initiatives will not be considered fashion statements that will fade in time. And that remains to be seen. I think one of my bigger disappointments in some of the buildings is how the vibrant street is treated. And you've heard the term podium and tower. The tower is the tall part, but the podium, or the base of the building, is the bit that animates the public realm. So we get back to the street. What does it do for the street? That, to me, is the bigger test. I have less concern about what the tower is looking like or doing, but I do have those first 4 to 5 floors are what we experience, and the landscaping next to them is what we experience. And if I go by the Maryland building today, you may have noticed this, there's a grocery, or there was a grocery, I don't imagine it's still there. And it had all these windows, and it sort of invited the idea of come in, there's a retail environment here, pedestrians should come in. But what did they do? They back painted all the glass with pictures of vegetables and words. So in other words, killed the vibrancy that you would have expected from a glass storefront. So these things, there's still a way for us to ruin what we think we've created. And so I know that what's coming in Square One today is much more of that Main Street, vibrant Main Street kind of image and character. And I'm encouraged by that. But getting a grocery store to occupy in one of those bases of the building is still a challenge. Getting an active grocery store. Right now we have Whole Foods, and they occupied a vacant tract at the north end of Square One. But how do you get something like that integrated with that streetscape? That's the next challenge we're facing. How do you get real retail, especially in the retail climate now? How do you get real office, especially in the retail climate we have today, or the office climate? And there's people looking at alternatives to going to a place of work. So there's a whole new thing emerging. And this could be a sequel to my talk, but it would be more about the effects of COVID on built form and city building. And it remains to be seen. I think there are so many positives that will come out of it. Still, I think it's kind of led us to the idea of the walkable community has come back. And I don't know if you're experiencing this, but on days this winter, I've seen more people walking the streets because of COVID than I've ever seen before. So it's kind of rekindled this idea about let's enjoy our immediate community. Let's get back down to that Jane Jacobs, 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer kind of space. And that's encouraging.
I'd have to agree with you on that. I certainly see a lot more people walking and interacting with the streetscape than any time before that I've been to where I am. It feels like there's more people out. Maybe more people have the time or the inclination just to walk from their home, particularly those that are working from home. In a way, with the closures, there's nowhere to go with your car. So it's
all of that. All of it. And sadly, it's meant that transit's taken a hit too, though, because people don't want to crowd onto the buses as much. But anyway, there's some interesting reawakenings that I think are promising for community. And through all of this, I got to say, we cherish our original founding communities of Streetsville, Port Credit. That's what got me, frankly, interested. I moved to Port Credit. I didn't move to Mississauga, and I'm still considered a snob for that. But how these fit into the bigger picture now is a really interesting question. The city has to act as one city instead of several different wards, and And that's a challenge because now we're developing waterfront, which should be seen as a benefit to the whole of Mississauga, not just to the spoiled people of Lakeview and Port Credit. Sorry, spoiled people of Port Credit. I can't say that about Lakeview yet.
You might get some flack. You might get some flack on that one.
I know I will. I know I will. I know from whom too.
So what is the future of that original Carmania concept of the single family home and urban sprawl? Like, new development plans are not going to erase the 40-year plus history of that landscape, at least not quickly.
No,
what do you see as the future of that?
Well, there's some interesting, let's call it retrofitting of the suburbs concepts that are coming. Ideas about simply allowing 2 families or 3 families to occupy a single detached house instead of one family. So that in itself is conceptually tripling the density of these underdeveloped or these low density areas. Now, already I can hear the public saying, well, how are you going to support 4 or 5 cars on a lot that only has a driveway and a garage filled with stuff? And that's a challenge. How are you going to sell? The basement units also have emerged as a potential, but the hurdles are pretty high, safety hurdles in basements. These basements were developed without any safe exiting.
Yeah.
So the retrofitting of a basement to make it safe is not an easy thing. So we hear about them. A few people have done them. Many are doing them illegally, unfortunately, but that's just the reality of that one, is that it's tough to actually make work. And then Toronto's going through an interesting study now of how to find ways to allow 4-story apartment buildings to be implemented within these neighborhoods, which typically means you have to assemble a few lots. And then you can build a low-rise 3 or 4-story apartment form, kind of a walk-up idea, as another way of completing our communities. So communities are not just nuclear families. They're brothers and sisters that need a place to live. There are a variety of types of arrangements that need to be accommodated. There's seniors that need to be accommodated. We find that any activities that start to challenge or change the nature of our sacred suburbs always get a pretty chilly response.
If I could interject, Michael, I've always said if there were more people who had conversations like you, then I would trust that they were in good hands for a future planning perspective. I'm interested to see how the city evolves, not only just in the times of COVID, but I look at the rising generation coming up and thinking, how on earth can they afford to establish themselves in Mississauga with the way the city has evolved, and just where does economics, where does it drive the next generation? Are we actually seeing a rebirth of the commuter suburb in the sense that a generation still has to go to work, but if they can't live near the place of work, then they'll need a car. And so what's the push-pull factor?
Yeah, no, the reality, the financial reality is that people are willing to commute 2 hours, maybe each way, to get to their dream location that they can afford, a house with a backyard. It may be in Kitchener, it may be in parts of Guelph, even those areas. And even Hamilton was attracting more affordable, or people looking for more affordability. But even now, Hamilton is going through a kind of pressure on that front too. So now you're thinking about Beamsville, or you're thinking about Font Hill down the Niagara Peninsula. You're going to have to, so that brings with it the GO train is part of this formula. The GO train extends to Guelph, and it's being considered to be extending beyond Hamilton.
Right.
And you're seeing affordability responses down there. But what it does is it just forces people to be further dispersed. And possibly through COVID, we're looking at telecommuting, which is, doesn't mean you physically have to commute, but that may allow people to work 2 days in a center or an office center, commute for 2 days a week, and do the rest from home for 3 or 4 days a week. So that to me is a potential way to bridge this economic problem, because we're not seeing government kind of, let's call it, support for affordability that much. It's a tough one, and the numbers are scary, just like numbers for transit are scary. If we had built it all more gradually, it wouldn't have ever been such a shock. But now it's very hard to get any project transit related or affordable related built. There's only a few examples I can think of. There's one that's going up now on Lakeshore here in Port Credit. And it's a very simple building, no basement. I mean, they've looked at ways to cut the cost of that structure. So there are some places where this can happen and where land can be found that still allows it to happen. But there's challenges on all fronts.
What are the opportunities that Mississauga has for its future in terms of its built environment?
Well, I think the examples of those right now, I mean, the ones that I find a lot of excitement about are the, the waterfront locations. I think the Imperial Oil lands is a great example of how you can build a new city with a range of height and density and retail and public realm. Again, the park spaces, the connectivity. These are examples of how you do it right. I do believe Lakeview has that quality as well. It's very exciting public realm components to that. So these to me are hopeful areas, but how to connect them all up is the next problem. And now we're starting to look at how to make Lakeshore a little higher order transit corridor. And every time you do that, it's going to attract more density. So beyond the borders of the Imperial Oil lands and the Lakeview lands, you're going to see buildings start to pop up anticipating those projects. So it could be that if it's not done with us a degree of control, we're going to get something that's quite not very harmonious, let's say. Like already I know there's a 17-story building being proposed on Lakeshore. It's at the old Elmwood grocery, the Planet Organic site. I don't know if you know that one, but that, I think there was a mention that there was someone who thought that a 17-story building would be appropriate. And that's probably a location where it would be totally inappropriate based on shadow, based on character, based on proximity of the houses. So there's things that we have to now, hopefully if we had been more prepared for that and had policies in play that suggested what the right approach to density and form was, we'd be in a better position. But right now there is a danger that there's a reality and a perception that the OMB or LPAT automatically approves anything a developer asks for. And in my experience, that's not the case. There's been a lot of bad decisions, but there's been a lot of good decisions. And as long as they're good decisions, as long as we have policies in play that are respected and can be brought to bear. So when on a project like what's being proposed, 17 stories on the old Planet Organic site, we could say, look, we have a place for our density. We have a place for taller buildings. This is not one of them. That's when the OMB or the LPAT pays attention. And that to me is an important difference that we have to prepare for in the future. And in some cases, we're already too late. But we have this will to grow that was exemplified in city center with an unlimited height regimen. And now we have pressures on our corridors in communities that we do like for their heritage characteristics and their history, like Streetsville and Port Credit. And we don't see as much in the way of reasonable limits. And by reasonable, I mean there is a minimum threshold and there's a maximum threshold. And somehow we got to find those sweet spots that make sense from an economic point of view, but make greater sense from an experience and character point of view. That's the challenge we have going forward, is staying ahead of that curve and not being reactive and responsive to bad development ideas. And to do that, we have to balance those things, economic realities with, with character realities. What's the character of our community, of our corridors? So that's the challenge in a nutshell. I see it in play right now.
But I think from the opportunity perspective, though, you also see, there's this balance of trying to plan for the future, but placate the present in a sense. And, the end result is often something that succeeds at neither. But there is opportunity here. We see some large sites that are now being developed that have opportunity to shape their own identity and perhaps the identity of what will come after them. I look at what's anticipated to come for the Dixie Valley Mall site, for an example. This will have, if we started the premise that change is coming, how can we develop that change to best embrace the qualities of what we want to see in our city in the future? And public transit has to be key to that. You said that, the public transit getting away from the automobile, there has to be some thought of that at some point. And when better than now, even if it's not popular.
Exactly. Yeah. And that, Dixie Mall is a great example of this, where there isn't transit today. There's a highway. There's no real transit. Dixie Road, I don't think, has a service on it. But if you accept the premise that there's an intensification that can be significant there by virtue of the land and its opportunity, you could imagine that it would inspire the viability of a transit link from Lakeview to Dixie. So all of a sudden, you've created a new link that doesn't exist today, that nobody really dreamed of, unless you're going golfing. You would never take transit, but it's a couple of golf courses on Dixie Road. But in light of the two anchors that are beginning to emerge at Lakeview and at Dixie, then transit's an obvious next step. If you planned it now, they might be ready for the time these projects emerge.
Right.
And I think that's the reverse engineering approach, is that we shouldn't stop doing Dixie Mall because there isn't transit. We should do it because it informs the viability of transit on another route in the city, another connection. And that's what I find lacking in the community consultations, is that hope for a change that could result from good planning, good intensified design. And I had this discussion, Don McVie, my neighbor, he made that very good point about Dixie Mall, is that why are the people of Mineola concerned about Dixie Mall? There's no immediate connection, unless you're worried about the QEW getting bunged up. But from a walkability and a kind of ideal community perspective, we really have no big interest in Dixie Mall, other than the potential for city building evolution is there. And the benefits of that are there. New park spaces, new public spaces, new programs, new community centers. These things come with more concentrated populations. And that's the hardest message to convince our neighbors of.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's a message that comes through in time. And yes, we'll take baby steps, but what we have outlined here in 40 years of culture is Mississauga was built on baby steps, really, of these ideals, on these aspirations of what was best. And arguably, perhaps we haven't yet settled on a single trend. We're still juggling trends, and maybe that's part of the character of our city as well, is this way that embraces and connects these different eras of thoughts to create the city that is continually evolving. It's fascinating to see, and I'll be fascinated to see. I don't know, Michael, can we reconvene in 40 years and see what we're like?
Well, I can guarantee you I won't be there, but hopefully the ideas might persist. But I started the presentation and I quoted Goethe, who the hell's Goethe? Anyway, he said, architecture's frozen music. And I always carry that because it's the, it's there forever in a way. I mean, the old cities, these things last for a long time. But and music lasts as well, but it also is susceptible to trends and changes very regularly. And we may never escape the trend component. component of architecture. But if we can get the fundamentals right, the connectivity, the walkability, the open space, the quality of open space with greening, with the public realm is the main message here. The public realm should be consistent. The buildings, they will always reflect some cultural presence, whether it's fashion, graphic design, music. That will persist, and there will be mistakes, missteps, and there will be personalities. You know, Frank Gehry, for example, there's a guy who put his thumbprint heavily on many cities around the world. That's part of the joy as well as the risk. If any of that's done badly, it'll stay there. It'll be bad for a long time. Brutalism comes to mind as a kind of architectural style that was called brutalism, maybe not for its implication, but for its use of concrete, and it's that raw concrete experience in an expressive sculptural way. So in a way, it was founded in this great idea or trend, and it's found new youthful vigor. So there's groups on Facebook that are all about brutalism being the next great thing. It's the next heritage movement. Anyway, these are all parts of the mess we try to sort out.
Well, it is one of those things where you said it earlier, you know, it comes around again, and you know, these ideas of treating spaces and treating buildings and how we view public space, you know, they come in fads and they come in waves, and the schools, in a way, maybe I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you see the schools of thoughts as reactions to the previous generation.
Yeah, they do. And I would say students generally get rewarded for fighting any past trends. Innovation seems to be rewarded. Innovation generally includes fighting, for example, a historic trend. Like, there are some architects that can do a very credible heritage-inspired house. But I know my colleagues all laugh at that. And that's why you see there are a lot of architects that actually work in the milieu of the individual home. There's a whole group of architectural technologists that have picked up that piece and run with it. And that's just a little different in the training side of it. One's more technical and is allowed to do smaller buildings like houses. So that group of people have emerged, but architects can stand back and say, "Oh, I don't do that. I can't do a traditional looking building that has, you know, finely wrought detail and material. I have to do a more Miesian, minimalist glass box. And, the slicker, the better." And there's design value in that. I kind of enjoy some of the new buildings that are that way. And so it's that trend challenge that we've got. It starts with our community, our architectural community, and how we reward those people, those students that graduate at the top of their class, tend to do bold but minimal things.
Bold but minimal. Maybe Michael, we should wrap on that. We're getting close to our time mark here, and I know you have to run, but I want to thank you. You inspire me. The depth of your thought on the subject and the way that you articulate the movement and the inspirations behind. I could talk to you for hours, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have, and I thank you for what you do, keeping the stories of Mississauga alive. The history of our city is deep and continues to be fascinating to me, and you paint it with your words and your stories, and I think it's a wonderful thing. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Now, maybe I'll leave you on one, and you might get a chuckle out of this, because we referenced him early on with the connection to Don Mills, and then of course here in Markborough, which was the revered Macklin Hancock in the planning world.
Yeah.
Resident here in Mississauga, lived for years on Camilla, and you know, he was somebody I took a little bit of architectural history in university, and he was a name that came up, and you know, obviously somebody who was well respected and well thought of. And I had an opportunity to sit down and do an oral history interview with him many years ago now. And I will never forget that, you know, I'm trying to prepare myself to meet somebody that I've only read about and know that his impact is there. And I drive to his house on Camilla Road, which is, if you've ever been to Hancock Woodlands, was anything but the suburban settlement. And here's Macklin in a ladder out of a tree picking apples. And I'm just trying to think, you know, there's the dichotomy of Mississauga at play right there. It's
very much so, yeah.
It was amazing. So that was my picture of Macklin, was up a ladder in a tree the first time I met him.
That's a great image.
Yeah, and it just you know, the remarkable ideas behind it. Again, you said some don't always pan out, but they have shaped our city and continue to shape our city. And you're part of that movement as well. I know your work is within the city, both from a preservation perspective, but also in the built environment. And you know, I thank you for that, and I thank you for the depth of thought that goes into it. I think a lot of people tend to look at buildings and don't realize the social consciousness that goes into designing and building in our city is quite remarkable.
No, it's a complex study for sure. It's never as simple as traffic.
Well, on that, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and take care of yourself.
Thank you, Matthew. Have a good night.
Thank you for spending time with us this week on Ask a Historian. It's been a distinct pleasure to have Michael Spaziani as our guest this week, as we explored some of the development stories of the city of Mississauga. We look forward to spending more time with you in weeks ahead as we look at the different stories and history of the city of Mississauga. Thank you.